This week here on The Interview on DW, Garry Kasparov, possibly the greatest chess player of all time. He's still dedicated to the game, but he's also a political activist and a fierce opponent of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Garry Kasparov, thank you very much for joining me here in Berlin today.
Thanks.
And a very warm welcome too to our international audience here on DW. Now, Garry Kasparov, I'd like to begin with you, the chess player, and I'd like to go back to your very early days, perhaps your first encounter with the game of chess. You were just 5 years old, and it made a great impression on you, I know, but it was a game that you weren't even playing in yourself. Perhaps you could tell us the story.
Unfortunately, nobody was there to tweet the story, so that's why I have to rely on the memory of my mother and very vague recollection of what's happened on that night, evening, whatever time was at Baku. I just watched my parents trying to solve a problem, and I was intrigued by the movements of these little pieces, and I learned most of the rules by actually following their logic. And when they discovered it, so my father made a big decision just to send me to the sort of chess group in the Pioneer Palace instead of doing musical lessons, as was traditional in his family.
You mentioned that you grew up in Baku in Azerbaijan, which was then part of the Soviet Union. I'd like to ask you whether you were a proud citizen of the Soviet Union. You did, after all, become later a member of the Communist Party.
Look, I grew up in the Soviet Union, and I guess many people in this country do understand, in Germany, what it meant to be born and raised in a communist country. And I was a product of my time, though thanks to the family of my father. My father died when I was 7, but his uncle and other relatives from his Jewish intelligentsia, they actually introduced me to sort of other sides of the story. So I could read a lot of books, and let's not forget, from age 13, I could travel abroad as a chess prodigy. So that's why I had a very different vision of the world. And as for Communist Party membership, it was preconditional. To challenge Anatoly Karpov and not to have all the problems, I had to do certain things, play by certain rules. But I left the party in January 1990, so 2 years almost before the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I was the first Soviet athlete who refused to play on the Soviet flag in September 1990 and played on the Russian flag against Anatoly Karpov in New York.
Despite all that, I'd still like to ask you whether you have any nostalgia for that time back then. I mean, a lot of people who grew up in the Soviet states, they do have nostalgia for that period. People here in East Germany do.
Most of these people, they have nostalgia about their youth. Just, we were young, which is absolutely normal. But no, the answer is no, I do not. It's just, I can't. So there's, I can separate, my youth, and my, first chess successes and winning the World Championship match in Moscow in 1985, 30 years ago, with the Soviet system. So it's two separate stories. And as a world champion, though being very young, I joined the pro-democracy movement, and in late 80s, I already, tried to invest my name and my popularity as the world champion in this process, of creating free, at that time we thought Soviet Union, but eventually free Russia.
We're talking about the Cold War period, and there are a lot of people now who are who claim or who believe that we're in a new Cold War, possibly, and I guess that you're possibly one of those people. Certainly your new book, which is out now, is called Winter is Coming, and the central message of your book is that Vladimir Putin has to be stopped. Why does he have to be stopped?
He already did enough, so I wish he could be stopped earlier, not to see the way he destroyed the security system that has been developed in Europe and in the world after World War II. Set aside Saddam Hussein and Kuwait, that was annexed in 1990, there was no other case of annexation of the territory of neighboring countries since 1945. And in Europe, it was unheard. And it's very clear that today Putin, as every dictator, reaches a stage where he needs enemies. And since he ran out of enemies inside the country, he's looking for enemies outside. And foreign policy, aggressive foreign policy, conflicts, confrontation has become an inseparable part of his domestic message.
Okay, so you've made your point. Vladimir Putin must be stopped. You stated your case, but the unfortunate truth is that in Russia, hardly anybody is listening.
Look, that's why, you know, Putin's dictatorship is so capable, because they eliminated opposition in Russia, and even people who might think otherwise, and I believe it's quite a number of them, we still talk about millions, they're afraid to do so. I mean, it's, I'm sure in 1938 and 1939 in Germany, not everybody agreed with Hitler, but you could hear their voices. Or in Stalin's Soviet Union. You know, it's Putin's dictatorship, and that's why I prefer to call him a dictator, not a president, just not to have any glimpse of democratic cover for his power. You know, it's at the point where they cannot afford any legitimate opposition side. And my dear friend, and one of the leaders of opposition, Boris Nemtsov, was shut down in front of Kremlin.
Mm-hmm. We'll talk about Boris Nemtsov in just a second, but I just want to there are many people here in Germany who argue that we must work harder to understand the Russians, to understand President Putin. People point to the way that the Russians felt humiliated around the crumbling of the Soviet Union, the crumbling of communism, a great empire, which it had always been, and that there are many people in Russia who view the what we call NATO enlargement, they call NATO expansion. And that's why they're willing to vote for a decisive leader, for a strong leader.
Stop insulting my intelligence. It's not about, you don't use word vote, because vote assumes that, you know, you have a campaign, you have other people, you have, you know, you can raise funds, you can register your party. In Russia, you can vote for Putin or else.
But so do you not believe that there is not a substantial body of the populace of Russia
but it just,
do back
it's
Vladimir
irrelevant.
Putin?
It's irrelevant. Again, you know, it's in Germany in 1938, in Soviet Union in 1952. It's useless to talk about elections. Dictators are popular because there's no opposition inside. And, you know, they have to step up with more aggressive acts domestically and eventually internationally to prop up their popularity. And in my book, I spend a considerable amount of time talking about the so-called humiliation. I mean, come on, we can talk about humiliation of Germany after World War I. But Russia, with all the help provided by Western Europe and the United States, you know, and NATO enlargement. Look, you know, it's if now Estonia or Latvia would not be NATO members, do you think that they could survive, you know, for 24 hours, you know, after Russian aggression? These nations had legitimate grievances. And thanks God, you know, NATO enlarged and protected these people who suffered a lot over the last, you know, century from potential uprising of Russian imperialism in Vladimir Putin.
Despite the all-pervasive nature of the Putin government, of the Putin regime, as some people would call it, people like yourself, you do believe that an uprising of some kind will be inevitable. I've read that quote from you. But that optimism is questionable, surely, when you talk about Boris Nemtsov, the way he was gunned down in Russia. It doesn't sound as though there's much room for optimism.
You may call it optimism, or you may call it realism, based on my reading of books of history. It does happen, you know. Dictators like Putin, dictatorship like Putin's can crumble overnight, or they can last. It depends mainly at this stage from the pressure from outside, because Putin's popularity in Russia and Putin's sort of claim to power is based on the image of Russia being sort of a fortress of good surrounded by evil empires that are trying to destroy Mother Russia. And Putin's geopolitical defeat, say Assad goes down, or else, somewhere else in the world where Putin is engaged in his fierce opposition against the free world, could dramatically weaken him in the eyes of not just ordinary Russians, but Russian elite. Because the way Russia has been run by Putin over last years, it's more like Mafia. The Mafia boss must look invincible. The moment his inner circle smells weakness, okay, they'll take care of him.
It was once said about you as a chess player, and I'm quoting here, that you had a desire not just to beat opponents, but to destroy them. Do you want to destroy Vladimir Putin? Because it sounds very personal here.
Look, I think we should separate the game of chess and my activities in Russia. I play chess to win. And when I entered, you may call it...
But you play this political battle to win.
It's not, no. I play, it was a moral imperative.
After the killing of Boris Nemtsov, you must want to win.
No,
that must have been
so
terribly painful.
No, I also live in exile. Yes, it's painful, but it's just, I believe that, there's something I should do for my country. That's why I did it in 2005. I mean, I stopped my professional career still being #1, and I had many other options in my life, but I believe that, I had to do that, at one point at least, to tell my kids that, I was involved in this battle, and I did my utmost to prevent Russia from sliding back to dictatorship. We don't want Russia to go in this vicious circle and just to be either repeatedly restored as a threat to the outside world. To the contrary, I want Russia to play a positive role because it's still a European country. And what's happening in Ukraine now, with many ethnic Russians joining the Ukrainian army to fight Putin's invasion, gives me hope that the Russian-speaking world would still be a part of the free world and mainstream of civilization.
Final question, Garry Kasparov. Do you believe that Vladimir Putin wants to destroy you, yes or no?
I know that if I go back to Moscow, it will be a one-way ticket. But
it's a yes. It's a yes.
I don't know how much he's willing to invest in that, but if he can reach me, I would be in great danger. So that's why I left Russia in February 2013, actually following the advice of Boris Nemtsov, who knew that I was in danger at that time. And it's very unfortunate Boris didn't follow the advice of his friends, and he stayed there until they took him.
Garry Kasparov, thank you very much for talking to Deutsche Welle today.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.